are 435 members in the House of Representatives. There are 100 members of the United States Senate. And today we are very pleased to have somebody who I think has the most unusual background of any of those 535 members of Congress, and that is Representative IIhan Omar from the 5th District of Minnesota. IIhan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Senator.
Your background is rather extraordinary, and I have the feeling it has influenced your political feelings. Talk a little, where were you born and raised, and what kind of childhood did you have?
Yeah, thank you. I was born in Mogadishu, Somalia, the capital city. I was born to a father who's ethnically Somali and a mother who is ethnically Yemeni. And it was, I think, an interesting start because, you know, my mother's family was considered a minority in the country, and my dad's family were the sort of dominant group in the country. And my mom and dad, when they met, traditionally, if you get married, either you live in your own house or you live with the man's family. And my mother was like, no, you have to come live with my family. And it wasn't traditional. And my dad broke that tradition and moved in.
So you're a rebel family from way back.
Yeah, from the start. And so I was raised in my grandfather's home with my mom's siblings. I'm the youngest of 7. And so it was, my mother passed away before I could develop memory of her. And so I was basically raised by my aunts and uncles and my dad and father. Really comfortable, beautiful home. They loved the arts. They loved music. And so I grew up with jazz music, country music, you know, sort of eclectic choices of music.
What
that
kind
I
of
grew
work
up in.
did your dad do?
My dad was a teacher. Most of them were educators, and my grandfather ran the lighthouses in the country. Somalia has the largest coastline, and both my father's father and my mother's father also come from fishing background, and a couple of my uncles were fishermen and traveled the world. And my dad's dad was a Coast Guard when the Italians colonized Somalia. And so I grew up in this very loving, very loud house, very competitive. Back in Somalia, when you went to school, they would post your scores publicly. And so we were expected to be number 1 because our aunties and uncles were our teachers in the schools. And so you didn't want to come home with them if you were not the top scoring kid. So I was like, education followed us home. And so it was a beautiful life. And then when I was 8, the country devolved into a civil war. And so I went from, you know, this happy childhood and playing with my friends to now having kids my age, carrying rifles, and, you know, hearing the bombardment every single day, our family being separated because we had to figure out how do we escape, and you can't escape collectively. And we eventually made it out to neighboring country, Kenya, or we entered a newly developed refugee camp in Mombasa. And I lived there for 4 years.
Talk about living in a refugee camp.
Yeah, it is.
You were now, what, 8 years old?
8. You know, you go from having a roof over your head to living in a concrete sort of environment where you have a door and, you know, you have your utilities, you have a bed, and you enter a refugee camp with nothing, and they give you a tent and some mats. And so you're now, you know, either sleeping on the actual floor or you have some sort of mat or plastic to sleep on, and then you face the elements: the rain, the sun, the threats of wild animals, the lack of sanitation. Because when a refugee camp is being built, they don't build everything. And so we would have to get in line in watering holes to try to get some water. And the area where they built the refugee camp, the locals did not really appreciate the fact that all these resources were being given to these people who came from somewhere else, and they were resourceless.
Was it a different language? Kenya, a different
yeah,
language?
yes. They speak Swahili, we speak Somali, and so there is a language barrier, and obviously there's also different tribal languages in Kenya, and so the locals we were living, because my grandfather spoke Swahili, but the locals that we were living near, they had tribal languages as well. And so we would have the few times we had the camp set on fire, because it allowed them to get jobs to help resettle. So it was a very traumatic environment. And then obviously we were displaced people and we're refugees, so there are guardrails to what you can do and where you can go.
Could you go to school? Were you getting educated?
No, because it took a long time for that to be set up in the camp, and we weren't allowed to leave the camp on a regular basis. And so, I became the designated family member because I was very young, and the chances of me being hurt by the locals or being arrested didn't really exist the way that it existed for my older siblings and my aunts and uncles. And so I had to fetch firewood. I had to get water. This was now my responsibility, and so I kind of became the designated person who would do that. And it was, in many ways, when you're a kid in that environment, it's kind of nice because there are not that many rules, and you now get to do a lot more than your elders can do. But it also is a very shocking thing to the system because you no longer know what your life is going to be the next day, right? There's no normalcy to anything. You're not waking up and going to school. You're not relying on regular meals. You don't know if you can, go use go to the bathroom without experiencing violence or being attacked by wild animals. So it really was.
You mentioned wild animals twice. What kind of animals were in the area?
Oh, hyenas, fox. We would hear the roars of bigger, predatory animals as well. Yeah.
Okay. And during this time, you were not in any kind of formal school?
No, I missed 4 years of schooling when I eventually made it to the U.S.
All right, so you spent 4 years in Kenyan refugee camp.
Yeah.
Then what happens?
And then we got the golden ticket. Our family was eligible for resettlement through the Refugee Resettlement Program. And we were able to come to the United States in 1995 when I was the age of 12. And we started out in Arlington, Virginia. And so I went to middle school here, and then we moved my freshman year of high school to Minnesota.
Did you know any English at this point?
No, the only English words I knew were hello and shut up. And so that was a fun start
So you went to school
sixth
not
grade.
knowing any English?
Yeah, and we had to learn really fast. My dad, who was fluent in multiple languages, came up with this idea that we'd watch the TV, and because we could read and write, we would read the captions and try to have dialogue with one another through the caption. And so we would pick a character. And so we would sort of have, and some of my siblings, had functional English. And the ones that didn't, this is sort of how we practiced. We watched the weirdest TV because we had no context on what was appropriate. Not like Baywatch was like one of the shows that we watched, Family Matters and others. And we became pretty functionally fluent in about 3 months or so. And so it was a very rigorous, like my dad was on us and didn't allow us to speak.
So unlike every other kid in America, your father said, watch television.
Yeah. I know it sounds really bizarre, but it was, his way of saying that you can try to learn a language through reading, or you can try to learn it by trying to have a conversation with someone. So it kind of made it look like we were having a conversation.
1 year in Arlington?
We were there for two and a half years.
2.5 years. Mm-hmm. And then you went to Minnesota. How did you end up your dad take you to Minnesota?
So my sister, one of my sisters, heard from someone that we were in the refugee camp with, who'd settled in Minnesota, that Minnesota had the highest educational achievement. It was like, I think, number one at the time. So in a conversation, she mentioned this to my dad. And my grandfather at the time got resettled in Iowa. So he was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa with his kids. And so she was like talking about this, and dad, wanted, obviously, because we'd missed a lot of education, wanted us to be able to graduate on time, and thought that we should move to Minnesota. And obviously there were better job opportunities there as well. And so when we got there, he worked at the postal office until he retired. And he was right. All of us did graduate on time.
And I had the opportunity, I know, to meet him a few years ago.
Yes, you did.
Yeah. All right. How does that rather extraordinary background shape your political views?
Oh, in so many ways. So I grew up in a household, unlike many American households, where we talked about politics, and the idea of going through such a traumatic civil war and life in a refugee camp and coming to a new country, you sort of start to understand like public policy in a way that the average 12-year-old might not be thinking about it, right? Because all of the decisions that displaced my family and eventually found us a new home were political. And for me, today, I try to mitigate those sort of bad political decisions that created the war, that displaced me, and then try to have empathy for the policies that created that refugee camp for us, that saved us, and allowed us to, come to the United States and have a stable life. And so when I talk about the impact of war, it's because I understand what that means and how that trauma never really leaves you. When I talk about displaced people, like I understand it in a deep level, and I want to mitigate what creates displacement. And when I advocate for a more generous policies towards people who have experienced unspeakable things, it's informed from the life that I had. And I think a lot of my anti-poverty, anti-hunger work also is informed by my lived experience. There is no way to explain the level of hunger you experience when you're fleeing war and crossing borders.
You had that experience.
Yes. I mean, I remember, when we were leaving the capital to go to another city before we eventually transitioned, we had to pay people to get in these trucks to leave and not deal with the militias that were killing each other. And here we are, 100 people, about 100 people cramped in the back of one of those big trucks, and it's going miles, and there's people on top of each other. And eventually the car breaks down and there's militia shooting at us. And so we have to run. So the little bit that we brought, the water, all of that, everybody has to leave it. Our shoes, we're running barefoot. It's the middle of the day. The sun is just like right here. And we had to walk 40 kilometers. And, not only are you hungry, but you're also thirsty. And then we ended up in a place called Barawe, this little small ancient city. And there was, because that was kind of like the place where a lot of the people who were fleeing the city ended up, there was literally nowhere for us to go. So we had to spend a couple of nights on the ocean shore, just sleeping there. And once in a while, the locals will bring, bread or something. But it was like almost 2 days of not having anything to eat and drinking salt water. And so it's, and then you've got the other systematic stuff that happens to your system when you're hungry. You can't move, you can't sleep, or when you sleep longer. And so when there's visitors and they bring something, you don't, you won't take advantage of it. And so it's like the one thing I say to people when I try to talk about what it means for us to get aid into some of these places, because the level of hunger is not, I missed dinner or I missed lunch or I didn't have breakfast today. It's real hunger.
Sounds like those memories are vivid, huh?
Yeah.
All right. So I suspect as an 8-year-old girl in Somalia, you didn't quite think you'd become a United States Congresswoman.
Oh, good God, no.
All right. So take us.
I didn't even think I knew where the United States was at the age of 8.
All right. So you went to college in Minnesota?
I went to college in Minnesota, but eventually graduated at NDSU in Fargo, North Dakota.
Okay. So how'd you get into politics in Minnesota?
Yeah. So when we moved to Minnesota, my grandfather also moved to Minnesota, so we could all be in the same place. And he was like the kind of person that just could never stop talking about the wonders of democracy and the opportunities it created and how powerful one's voice was. As a youth, he was involved in decolonizing Somalia and getting rid of the Italians, and really desperately thought that it could be possible for Somalia to have a democracy. And they did. Somalia was regarded as the first democracy of Africa, but it was extremely short-lived. And they ended up having a dictator for a really long time. So when he came to the U.S., like the first thing he wanted to do was participate in our democracy. And he'd heard about something called the caucuses at his English class. And he was like, you have to take me. And so I took him, but he didn't speak English. And so I had to interpret for him. And, we were in a room with like 9 people, very small community room. And it was such a very sweet grassroots process that I'd felt so bad that my grandfather, who had been my guide throughout my entire life, who knew about democracy more than anyone I knew, who's eagerly awaited that day to arrive, now was in a process that he couldn't fully access. And so I stayed involved in that process to make it more accessible for people like my grandfather, and working with the DFL to create translated flyers and translate the process and create videos. And so I just kind of remained civically engaged through that process and continued to organize politically while I graduated high school and got married and had kids and went through college. And then when I became a nutrition educator, I'd found myself teaching at the same classrooms that my grandfather was in for New American adults. And, I start talking to them about vitamins and nutrients, and they'd be like, we don't know where to find housing or proper housing. We don't know, how to get a driver license. Like, can you help us with our citizenship test? And I would teach at high schools for young moms or moms-to-be, and they'd say the same thing. I don't know if I can find housing for my child and we lack transportation access. I don't really like taking the bus with my babies. Miss Ilhan, can you help? And so all of our conversations would become about policy and politics and who represented them and where to find resources. And the same thing happened when I would teach at elementary schools. After I did the after school program at elementary schools in one of the neighborhoods I now represent, North Minneapolis. And they would say, like, I've never seen this fruit or vegetable that you brought as a sample. And we would talk about the food desert that they were living in. And so that got me thinking, like, something has to change about the people who are representing us. And so I would invite them to meet your representative events that I would host. And I'd bring the school board member and the city council member and the different people who represented them, even had Keith Ellison at one of those. And I eventually started connecting this idea of, a representative democracy. And my grandpa used to say that to him, it meant that the people who represent you should have fluency in your day-to-day struggles. And it was starting to become evident that the people who were representing us did not have that. And so I got involved with some other young people who were also starting to notice that. And we started running people for office to replace the school board members, the city council members. And so my politics were very, very local. And then eventually there was a state representative that was representing us for 44 years. And I ran a candidate, and we did not succeed. And I was very upset. And my friends were like, you seem very invested. So you should run against her. And in 2015, I did that, and we were able to win that race in 16 and defeat that 44-year incumbent, and became the first Somali legislator in the country. And eventually, when Keith announced that he was not running for re-election, a year and a half into my first term, decided to take the leap. And it was a 6-way race, and we won by 18 points. So
there you go.
Here I am.
And you have won. So now you're into your fourth
I'm in my third, and this is my fourth,
fourth campaign.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You and I have worked together on some issues. Mm-hmm. What are your priorities as a member of the Congress? What are you fighting for?
Yeah. So one huge priority that I have, and actually it was the reason I first decided to run for office, was the crippling student debt that continues to persist and make it really hard for so many Americans to actualize the American dream. And I know you and I introduced legislation, but we've also been really successful in trying to get the Biden administration to do something about it, and we'll continue to persist on that.
They have now forgiven how many millions of that?
157 billion for 4 million borrowers. Yeah. But there's about 30 million borrowers that are in the pipeline now. And so it would be about 34 million, hopefully towards the end of his first term.
I was at a college, was Morgan State in Baltimore. and we were chatting about these things, and some woman got up, literally with tears in her eyes. I think she was a faculty member. Said, I owed $80,000. I was struggling with this forever.
Yeah.
It's been forgiven. My life was transformed.
Yeah.
I don't know if you bumped into that, but it's a huge, huge deal.
Yeah, we run into people like that every day. Actually, Clyburn, Jim Clyburn, who is the former whip, was just telling me a story on why he became an advocate. Is that one of his constituents had $400,000 forgiven. He said about 150 for his wife. Can you imagine how liberating it must feel to not have to worry about a cumulative, over 500,000
Well, we have
of
talked to people who delay getting married, delay having kids, and the insanity. I mean, this is not like you lost money in Las Vegas. This is, what did you do? You went and did what you should do. You got an education, and you shouldn't leave school hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt for the rest of your life. So thank you for what you've done. I've been pleased to work with you on that. And we have made some success. We still have a long way to go.
We do. Yeah.
What else?
I mean, and another one that we also collaborated on is ending childhood hunger. In this country, I carried the universal school meals now for 3 terms. And, I think through the introduction of that bill that we did back in 2019, it has inspired states to pick up the mantle as Congress tries to figure out what it means to actually serve the children of this country. And now we have, states like Colorado, California, Minnesota, New Mexico that have created universal school meals. And in Minnesota, there was some reluctancy when I was first there and talking about doing this. And now the governor sees the polling that says 74% of Minnesotans approve of it. And every single day, they are celebrating that win. And as you and I know, many of the policies we advocate for are really popular with the American people.
Yes.
And
sometimes not with wealthy or powerful special interests, but with ordinary people, almost always they are popular.
Almost always, yeah. And that's what I remind people, that if this place was truly of the people and for the people, we would not have the economic disparities that we have, that seems so shocking to many people across the world, to talk about the fact that there is not a universal health care in the United States, and countries like Cuba are able to provide that. To talk about the fact that we have childhood hunger in this country that is persistent. It's maddening.
The bottom line is that the Congress is way, way, way out of touch with where the American people are and the needs of the American people, and it has everything to do with the corrupt political system, which billionaires buy elections. So that is the reality, and that I know is what you're fighting to change as I am. Yeah. All right, let me get into an issue that is on the minds of, searingly on the minds of millions of people, and that is the war going on in Gaza right now. Your take on the situation. Yeah. And let me be very clear. I have been outraged. My view has been that Israel had the right to defend itself against this horrific attack by Hamas, a terrorist organization, but they did not and do not have the right to go to war against the entire Palestinian people, which is what they are doing. That's my take on it, but tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really unconscionable to witness the complete dismantling of nearly 80% of infrastructure, the death and destruction of nearly 35,000 people, of whom 70% are women, children, and the elderly, to watch people still stuck under the rubble of concrete buildings. And I think for me, at the moment, the thing that has been really hard to continue to make sense is the fact that there is a forced starvation and an impending famine, and the world has not intervened to stop it. Even with the recent blocking of the invasion of the Rafah crossing, which means even the little aid that was getting in is not. We have 26 American doctors and nurses who are aid workers who finished their tour that are stuck at the European hospital. We heard about a nurse that has an IV in, and there's no ability for them to leave and no ability for new aid workers to get in. And to watch sometimes the spokespeople for the administration and to remember their empathy, rightful empathy, when children were being killed in the Ukraine war, when there was death and devastation, and to now see them excuse this as the casualty of war, really messes up with any sense of humanity that you could expect collectively from people. I'd been saved by humans who didn't know me, should not have cared, but because their humanity pushed them to provide safety and protection and a new beginning for my family. And I am just constantly shocked at what people are willing to allow for an ally to do to helpless society in Gaza without a worldwide condemnation. So I do hope that there is an end. I hope that there is a negotiated ceasefire, that hostages are brought home to their families. I've met with families of hostages. It's very heartbreaking to hear about. But I do hope eventually that there is real accountability for what Israel has done, and that we also stop the impunity that we provide to them when it comes to accountability through the international community.
All right. On that distressing note, all right, anything else on your mind?
What's keeping you up at night these days?
Well, many of the same things that you talked about, this war in Gaza, and the knowledge that as we speak, it is likely that tens of thousands of children are facing starvation, and that the level of barbarity goes on in the year 2024. We had hoped that the world would have gone beyond that to allow this to happen, and that is very upsetting. And I worry about the future of democracy in America, and I think the fact that, you talked very well about, your grandfather talking about the role of democracy, and the fact that our government is not responding to the needs of so many people makes them say, hey, really, why should I vote? What difference does it make? Yeah. And when you have that attitude, when government is ignoring the needs of lower income people, working people, that's when authoritarianism develops, right? And that worries me very much. We talked about climate a little bit. If Trump is elected, the signal will go out all over the world. Forget it. You don't have to cut carbon emissions. That game is over. And I don't know what the planet looks like in 10 or 20 years, but it will be. There was a piece in the paper today that insurance companies are now holding back coverage because they're worried about the kind of claims that will come from extreme weather or flooding or whatever it may be. So we're dealing with that. You and I know that women's rights are under severe attack. Hard to believe that in America we're receding. Women struggled for decades to control their own bodies. We're in trouble there. So
my daughters are going to grow up with less rights than what
That's right.
what I found when I came to the U.S. Yeah.
That's what I worry about in the early part of the evening. Then it gets bad later on. But then, got to figure out, right, how do we deal with all of this stuff? And the main point that I think you made is all of the things that we talk about. Healthcare is a human right, that you should not have to go $300,000 in debt because you went to graduate school, that we have to save the planet from the ravages of climate change. These are not radical ideas. Vast majority of the people understand it. But
So I have to tell you a funny story.
good. I need some funny stories.
Because I want to hear your reaction. Because that's what I was thinking as I was hearing. I was like, oh, Bernie would have had some words to say. So I'm running for re-election. I'm in a primary that is very contentious, and I recently had a 20-minute debate at the convention before we won our endorsement, and we were asked about what are we doing to address the climate crisis. So I talk about our Green New Deal legislation. I talked about our zero advocacy for zero waste and getting that in the infrastructure bill. I talked about the climate wins with the Inflation Reduction Act, and what more we need to do. So my opponent says before we ask oil companies, we have to take to do something. We have to take personal responsibility, and his contribution is driving a hybrid.
I see. That's going to solve the climate crisis.
So that's...
Well,
those people still exist.
Yeah. Well, what's even worse, and my colleague Sheldon Whitehouse had a good hearing on this. I'm on the budget committee where he did this, is you have oil companies, ExxonMobil and others, who have known for decades. Right. It's not like somebody woke up 2 years ago and said, oh my God, carbon emissions are really causing enormous problems.
Because they've also been paying for the misinformation and the climate deniers.
They've known this for 60 years.
Yeah.
And they lied.
Yeah.
So what do you say to a group of people to protect their profits who lie about the product they're producing, which is destroying the planet and impacting the lives of billions of people? And, they've got to talk about accountability. Well, those guys got to be held accountable as well. Yeah.
And when I hear an answer like the one my opponent gave, I think about, oh, they want polluter money. Because that's the only reason that you would, let them off the hook. And I hope that we continue to have climate champions in Congress and those efforts grow.
It is the difficulty of this particular issue is that even in fairness to Biden, we have managed to do some reasonably good things. We're putting more money into energy efficiency and sustainable energy by far than ever before. But we've got to do it as a planet. China has got to be working with us. Russia got to be working with us. And that makes it very, very difficult. But we don't have a choice on this one.
No, you got to stay persistent.
Yeah. All right. That's it. So, folks, you are looking at one of the more remarkable members of the U.S. Congress, and I'm a big fan of IIhan's.
Likewise.
Proud to have endorsed her and worked with her. And we did some nice rallies in Minneapolis, And IIhan, keep up the great work. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Senator.